Hi, my name is Blair Imani. I'm the author of Read This to Get Smarter about race, class, gender, disability, and more. And with me today is Dr. Shay. Please introduce yourself, Dr. Shay.
Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Shay-Akil McLean. I am an ecologist, an evolutionary geneticist, as well as sociologist, and the creator of Decolonize All the Things. So a lot of stuff that I do is predominantly surrounding studying human health, because I'm also a biological anthropologist and sociologist.
Fabulous. So today we're going to be talking about chapter number 5, Get Smarter About Race and Racism. And this wouldn't have been able to be written without Dr. Shay and your own dissertation, which will you please talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah, so my dissertation was titled Du Bois Meets Darwin, and it's pretty much a project that looks at trying to get into a better job and sense of language surrounding how do we talk about race and racism and human health without reproducing racialized distinction in racial ideologies.
Yeah, so basically what that looks at is how do we make sure that we're looking at things in an anti-racist lens without doing racism? Because so much of race and racialization has to do with medicine and biology and science. So how do we undo that and come forward with a better understanding? So I will do a little bit of a reading here. It's on page 95 if you're following along. As a Black person, I have often been asked, why do you have to bring race into this? This question usually makes me laugh because I deal with frustration through humor. But it also makes me reflect on the reality that race is a massive part of my life as a Black person in the United States. I do not bring race into things. I was brought in to race. Human beings have existed for 200,000 years, but race has only existed for about 600 years. Race is not a biological fact, or even something that humans discovered and then exploited to oppress others. Race was invented and implemented specifically for the purposes of oppression. In this chapter, we will learn about the invention and implementation of race and the ensuing consequences. And then I'll just read you a little bit more from the intro. Political and race theorist Dr. Utz McKnight explains that race is not what describes human difference, but what humans use to create the possibility of difference. Racism uses race to create difference and then assigns meaning to and ranks humans as superior or inferior based on those differences. As explained by Dr. Dorothy Roberts, acclaimed scholar of race, gender, and the law, race is not a biological category that is politically charged. It is a political category that has been disguised as a biological one. Race is not a fact of biology or genetics, but because of its impact on all elements of society, it's a very real aspect of life that we must examine and get smarter about. Race and racism permeate every corner of society that has been touched by European colonization. In this chapter, we will explore how it is internalized by us, intrapersonal racism, affects our interactions, interpersonal racism, and impacts the larger infrastructures that control society, institutional racism. In the United States, for example, race and racism exist to serve and maintain white supremacy. As we get smarter about race and racism, we must be prepared to do lots of unlearning and relearning. So with that understanding and what Dr. Shay discusses, I want to look at so many different things. But first I want to talk about, and kind of interview you. When people say race is a construct, I feel like it's inadequate because a lot of people don't understand things like, social construction or social reproduction theory. So when you talk about race, and I cite you here in the book, what do you think is the best way to start out? Or what are a lot of misconceptions that people need to get smarter about?
One of the things that I think makes that difficult about, like you said, people say race is a social construction, but we don't really understand what social construction means in a lot of senses. I think the best way to generally start a conversation with people who are trying to learn more and get smarter about the topic is that race is a child of racism. That way we can understand that there is a particular historical relation between the two, and more importantly, a specific form of a functional relation between them as a larger system.
Definitely, and we have to understand it in terms of systems. Let's talk about this in the section on race. Another way of saying that race is a human invention is to say that it is a social construct. Social constructions are the ways humans organize society to support their assumptions about humanity. In terms of race, these assumptions include two key elements described by historian and anthropologist Patrick Wolfe. One, difference is not neutral, to vary is to be defective, and two, race links physical characteristics to cognitive, cultural, and moral ones. These assumptions are not based on evidence or reality. Instead, the ways we define reality have been constructed to reinforce racist lies. How humans perpetuate, maintain, and recreate social constructs over time is called social reproduction. And so these things are super essential to understand, but the problem is that we can see all different aspects of society and industry and different fields, not just academia, but the ways we communicate with one another, that are influenced negatively by racialization. Things like over-policing in Black communities, things like gentrification, segregation. There are so many different ways this shows up. But I also cited here the association, the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, and Dr. Shay actually worked on that memo. The quote that I have here is, "Race does not provide an accurate representation of human biological variation." Will you break that down for us?
Yes. So a lot of times when we have conversations about biological variation, it's commonly also referred to as diversity. But please make sure you note this is not to be conflated with our usual understanding of racial diversity or other forms of socio-political diversity. So with regards to race not in any way being an accurate reflection of human biological variation, there are so many, for example, gene variants that exist within the human species. And they exist across all kinds of different populations because the populations are ones that we create and come up with. They're boundaries that we utilize in order to help us have a better understanding in a statistical sense about what genetic variants exist within the human species. But most importantly, the categories that we know of today as race have absolutely nothing to do with human genetic variation in the sense that they in any way reflect or mirror the biological variation that exists there. None of those categories that we have for race and racialization can tell us anything about human evolution. But human evolution can tell us a lot about a lot of the political shifts that we've seen through human history, and even tell us about some of the consequences of organizing our societies based on racial ideologies in a larger genetic and biological sense, because it does have a lot of consequences with regards to how it affects the lived and material world that we experience.
That's fascinating. And Dr. Shay's dissertation is going to be available for publish very soon. I'll make sure to link to it. I was able to sit in when the dissertation would be presented, and it was just so, eye and mind opening. But one of these things that I talk about when we say things like it's not an accurate representation of human biological variation is people will say, but Blair, white people have straight hair and Black people have curly hair. White people have narrow noses and Black people have wider noses. And then we'll even see things where people will say that that's because in Africa the air is more humid, so we had to have wider noses in order to breathe. That's unique to Black people. What do you say to folks like that?
The one thing that I definitely say to folks like that who make those kinds of comments first is that, well, where do you think humans came from? African continent. So if that was the case and we were relying solely on the temperature and the amount of humidity in the air on the African continent, we would then have to extend it to the entire species. So that means that in most cases, we are not going to be able to just make massive generalizations. One of the things that's a prime fact of evolutionary biology is variation itself. Without variation, a species does not exist. That's basically how you end up in a situation to where it goes extinct. Variation is a fact of life. And it's important for us to understand that a lot of the generalizations that we hear about entire groups of people or entire societies or even entire cultures are just that, generalizations. And we do understand in the sense that a generalization can very easily wipe out our understanding of all that is possible and all that has already occurred and is out there. So it's important for us to have a really critical eye when it comes to being careful about, oh, well, that's because of this, or that's because I know this, or these people are in this area, and then we can use that as a justification for why their biology looks a certain way. Biology is not in any sense of a way a useful metric for understanding human history and also understanding why humans behave in a certain way. We actually need as much as pretty much every single discipline that we have throughout human knowledge in order to understand life itself, because life doesn't occur in disciplines. We use disciplines in order to help us have different perspectives so we can utilize them to then have more accurate depictions and analyses of what's happening in human life.
Amazing. It's very true. We can't just separate humanity into different departments and fields. Science, anthropology, biology, all of these things are happening simultaneously. And history is definitely there too. And as a historian, I'm always happy to point that out for people. One of the things that I want to bring up too is in this timeline of the invention and implementation of race. And this is on page 100, right in the middle. I wanted to talk to you all about 1758 with Swedish botanist and scientific racist Carl Linnaeus, who classifies human beings into 6 variations with descriptions for skin color, body features, hair color, hair texture, eye color, behavior, form of government, and clothing. Form of government is it's kind of out of the ballpark, but okay, we're going to be ridiculous, we're going to be ridiculous the whole way, Carl Linnaeus. Now, even though Linnaeus does not use the term race, the descriptions he attaches to the variations he invented are deeply and objectively racist. These 6 variations include wild people, Homo sapiens ferus; red people, Homo sapiens americanus; white people, Homo sapiens europaeus; yellow people, Homo sapiens asiaticus; black people, Homo sapiens africanus; and monster people, Homo sapiens monstrossus. Now, the troubling thing when it comes to discussing race and racialization is that some of us still operate based on these flawed understandings, these harmful understandings. I've still seen medical textbooks that discuss humanity being split into 3 primary categories: Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid. But these things are not accurate, and we see the consequences of them. There's a crisis of missing and murdered indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit folks, and constantly they'll find Jane Does, people who may have been missing and murdered indigenous women, and they'll categorize them as being European, as being white. So constantly, as people look through these different databases and they're looking for a missing white person, they're missing the fact that these people's bodies have been racialized incorrectly from what they actually are and how they understand themselves as indigenous people and not as Europeans. And those people go missing. And even after they have passed from this life onto the next, we cannot find them because the racialization and this idea that there are 3 categories of people, it erases so many other people, and it's also fundamentally inaccurate. So will you talk to us about how we got to some of these assumptions other than with folks like Carl Linnaeus?
So when it comes to thinking about the different categories of racialized notions that we are more familiar with seeing specifically within biology and natural sciences and medicine.
And those things being like black,
yellow,
yellow,
red, the general color designations. These things were best understood as post hoc justifications, meaning that Eurocolonialists understood what they desired and wanted with regards to taking land, taking resources from different places. They did what they needed to. And then it was after the fact that they had to come along with the justification. So the science, quote unquote, what we see of these scientific categories came so much later than the initial start, quote unquote, of colonial violence. So one of the things I try to get people to think about, for instance, especially with regard for the example you gave with the experiences of the indigenous people of Turtle Island and their communities constantly being the victims of violence, especially indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. We constantly racialize people, right? Then when we have to deal with going to look for them and look for their remains, we're still using these racialized ideologies and distinctions to then go search for remains and then verify the identity of the remains themselves. But that's a problem because racialized biology is not in any way an accurate representation of actual evolutionary biology. So as a result, we are using these different frameworks and categories that were made up for the sole purpose of reproducing colonial relations, and then extending that even literally into death, to the point to where we cannot identify people.
And it's not just identifying people. Because of segregation, so many cemeteries we're segregated. And you know that America is deeply racist when they're trying to separate people after death. Like, you're literally not around, but we don't want black folks and white folks mingling. And let's talk more about this biological situation, especially when we talk about phenotype and how people are meant to look based on their genes. Now, there's things like ancestry DNA where they could do kind of an approximation to see if their things were right. And based on my ancestry DNA decided that I would be a browner skinned person. But what we have to understand is that when it comes to phenotype and when it comes to genotype and all these different things, when it comes to color and racialization, we need to expand on this, because if we look at the timeline of race, it wasn't until 1664 in the Americas or in Turtle Island that a black skin was used to racialize people as black, and also being held in perpetual bondage regardless of whether they were Christian or not. So let's talk about color and race a bit if we can.
Yes. So a lot of what Du Bois points to in his work, W.B. Du Bois, a lot of his early work, specifically an article that he published in 1898, in that article he actually defines blackness. He does an excellent job of dropping that definition, as well as providing us with a definition of a social problem. Du Bois does, with helping us have a better understanding of what blackness is grounded in a historical analysis. It's about power. So one of the things that's most important for us to understand is that we are always speaking in relation when we talk about racialization, and we're also constantly talking about relations of power. So the matter of color becoming an issue was, once again, a post hoc. It was a reactionary convenience. So that was the reason why W.B. Du Bois referred to race but a mark. Because it's literally what it literally what it was and what it is. Basically, what ended up happening is we ended up dealing with Eurocolonialists coming up with ways of just creating homogenous groups that did not exist before, that had completely different histories and dynamics and their own languages, smashing them together, and then coming up with these categories. And this is something that historian Theodore Allen talks about in his book, The Invention of the White Race, and I believe the second edition of it was published in 2012. But this is one of the texts that I use in the class that I teach on Intro to Health and Wellness in the Black community.
And so, just quickly to make that more concrete for folks, is when we talk about taking these distinct groups and making them homogenous, we can think about the displacement of enslaved Africans as they're brought to the United States. A key feature of white supremacy and chattel enslavement was to separate people who spoke different distinct dialects, who had different distinct cultures, and smash them together to create this one homogenous idea of blackness, and to create a monolith, and to have all of these assumptions and stereotypes attributed to these things. And that still happens kind of posthumously. Like, we're still seeing folks who erase like traditional African religion, spirituality, people who will, in hindsight, say that all people who came to the United States were Muslim or African Muslims as they came. Those things are not necessarily true either, and we don't actually know because there's been so much harm done. But folks were taken and separated. So if we had 12 people from one tribe, they would make sure that those people got separated into different cohorts, of enslaved people, to make sure that folks couldn't unite, to communicate to one another, and still communication happened. And that's become a core feature of blackness in the United States, racialized blackness in the United States, is finding unique and distinct ways to communicate. And that's actually one of the ways that we get things like hip hop and rap music, and the development of African American English and things like that. But this is what we see, is that they'll take folks, separate them, and that's a part of segregation as well, where we can see the policy aspect of it too.
Yes, and one of the initial experiments that we see in race and racialization that Eurocolonialists engaged in is in segregation. So they basically, British India and Calcutta, that's where it was in the early 1700s, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, where they initially started experimenting with how they structured cities. Yes,
I actually have a citation here. This was kind of after the fact. In the 1857, the year-long Indian Rebellion of 1857 begins in an attempt to end the colonial rule of the British East India Company. Following the suppression of the uprising, power is transferred from the British East India Company to the British monarchy, and under this new rule, colonizers implement racialized policy against intermarriage between racialized people and white people, and mandate the segregation of Indian people.
Yes. Because it was born out of the general interest in having the colonizer quarters and the colonized quarters. And this is something that even Frantz Fanon talks about and his work in Wretched of the Earth, as well as a little bit in Black Skin, White Mask.
A classic. If you haven't read Black Skin, White Masks yet, please put it on your list.
Definitely do. And if I'm not mistaken, when I was talking about a little bit with the experimentation, racial experimentation with segregation of cities, the early segregation of cities, this is spoken about in a book by Carl Nightingale, who's a historian on the history of segregation. And he talks about this a good bit and provides a lot of context for some of the things that you come across in the book with regards to basically having a sense of understanding, like, when did they start having these assumptions about, okay, we'll use blackness rather than African as the emphasis for the categorization of this group of people. And pay close attention to how things happen in the order they happen in, because they came up with their assumptions about what they would utilize as the boundary and framework for blackness and indigeneity and native before they ever came up with the conclusion that they wanted to basically come up with a group for themselves, which is whiteness. That wasn't until 1691.
Yes, we have it in here as well. The first time that we see the word white appear, 1691. Dr. Shay knows his citations. White first appears in reference to white people in the Virginia colony for the purposes, right? Because it's always for the purpose of perpetuating power, for the purposes of banning marriage between black and white people. This begins a long history of anti-miscegenation laws in the United States, which ban marriage or reproduction between racialized people and white people. And let's dig into this a little bit. We get folks like our good old friend Charles Darwin, who helps to perpetuate some of these fears, talking about how Darwin suggesting in 1872 that biological race has been created through either sexual selection or natural selection. He wasn't sure. He was wrong in both counts. And he also asserts that when distinct biological races reproduce or mix, they form a new distinct race. This uses baseless pseudoscience to incite continued panic about racial impurity resulting from miscegenation. So now when people are saying things like, oh, I don't want these folks living around my family because they're dangerous because of all these racialized, sexualized dynamics, now they're able to say, well, it's just science. It's just science. But we have to understand that it's not about being anti-science. It's understanding that science is a creation of humanity and it can be used like anything else as a tool of political oppression.
Because in a lot of cases, people generally assume that science can be just distinct and independent. And pure. And nothing is, honestly. It's important for us to understand that. Scientists are humans. Science is a human practice. Meaning that in many ways, just like anything else, science also requires ethics. And it requires that we constantly be in conversation with one another about how we can go about engaging in our scientific interests and pursuits in ways that do not harm other people, as well as don't harm other living things that are not humans.
Alrighty, well, I've had a fantastic time interviewing Dr. Shay. Actually, the last person I interviewed here was Dr. Terrence Roberts, who was on a Little Rock 9, and that was back when I was an actual child. That's available on YouTube as well if you want to check that out. Highly recommend. But Dr. Shay, I thank you so much for helping make this book a possibility, being just my mentor. Like, if this was me doing a master's degree, you were my thesis advisor, and I appreciate you for that. But I want to know, for folks, where do you see the application of this book going?
The application of this book goes everywhere. Like, there are so many people whose Thanksgiving dinners will be saved this year because they will be able to just drop this instead of screaming at their family member. I will have multiple copies on me for this very reason, as well as just application, of course, across classrooms in the sense of thinking beyond the general structure of grades that we tend to regarding ageism. This is something that you can talk to teenagers about. You can talk to adults. You can talk to elders about this. I'm definitely going to be utilizing this in teaching with it because it'll make my life 10 times easier. So there's that. But also, this is something that could really bring people together in a sense to where they can have conversations about things that, in a lot of sense, people carry a lot of stress and frustration and discomfort about because they feel that in a sense to where they're nervous about saying the wrong thing. And a lot of that is not necessarily about being embedded with somebody's ego. We were all socialized into believing that race is biologically real, that gender is
inherent.
It's inherent in this. Gender is a fact. It's a social fact, but it's not a biological one.
It's a social assumption, and assumptions, they're
Yes.
not facts, as much as society likes to tell us. And so I think it's the patience, right? I want to make sure that knowledge is never used as a weapon, that we can all get smarter. It's called Read This to Get Smarter, because that is something that we all do. We are all right now in this moment demonstrating intelligence, which is the ability to acquire and apply skills and knowledge. And that's not something that can be quantified in any single IQ test. That's only one type of an intelligence measurement, and it's also very reliant on a lot of specific context. So everybody can get smarter, and I hope that you've gotten smarter today. Thank you so much, Dr. Shay. You always help me get
Thanks.
smarter. And learning is a blessing. I'll catch y'all next time.